good afternoon friends. Welcome to the CEC-UGC live lecture. Dear friends, in this session today we would be talking on identity theory in philosophy of mind, and for this discussion we have once again with us in our studios Dr. Ajay Verma. Dr. Ajay Verma is Associate Professor in Center for Philosophy, School of Social Science, JNU. So let's welcome our guest Dr. Ajay Verma and let's try to understand the topic in detail. Hello sir, welcome to the UGC lecture.
Thank you, Geetika. Hello viewers. So as you're already aware, we have been talking about philosophy of mind in the current series, and we have already talked about generally the subject matter, the domain, the kind of themes, ideas that we discuss as a part of philosophy of mind. And in that series, we have also discussed briefly substance dualism and the idea behind behaviorism. And in the same series, today we'll be talking about identity theory, which comes after behaviorism. Behaviorism, as we talked about it in our last lecture, starts to appear around mid 20th century, around 1950s, and within a span of about a decade or so, it kind of loses its steam and paves the way for other theories to emerge. And immediately after behaviorism, the kind of ideas that make their appearance as far as the area of philosophy of mind is concerned is identity theory. So first of all, let's try to have a brief idea about what exactly is the idea behind identity theory. As the phrase itself suggests, identity theory is basically the idea that what we call mental states can be completely explained in terms of certain kind of brain states. So here the idea is that brain, which is the center of the nervous system that all biological beings have, that is and that which is also physical in nature, which has physical properties. So all our mental states, all our experiences could be explained in terms of their constitutive brain states. So the idea, with the broad idea here, is that whenever we refer to any mental experience, any psychological experience, it has as its physical counterpart some kind of state of brain. Now, it'll make sort of more sense to us if we try to contrast it, with the behaviorist approach. The behaviorist approach basically wanted to do away with the requirement in philosophy of mind that whenever we want to explain any of our psychological experiences, any of our mental experiences, any mental states, then since mental states are accessible only by the person concerned, and it has to the trigger for it has to be somewhere inside the physical body of the person experiencing that, but at the same time we did not have access into our brain, and moreover it seemed almost impossible to believe or rather to prove that any psychological experiences would have some kind of corresponding state in the brain, because brain was not so much accessible. At the same time, though, it needs to be clarified here, it was not that that human dissection was never done. It was not that that nobody had sort of earlier dissected the brain and discovered what lies there inside. As a matter of fact, if you look at the history of medical science, starting from an important Greco-Roman thinker, Galen. There have been number of accounts accepting the medieval period, where when the dissection of human brain was done, and it was discovered that there are three empty spaces there, which it was believed by many of these thinkers correspond to that provided kind of space to some of the abstract emotions that we might have. So basically, it was believed that since many of our emotions, many of our psychological states like pain, like sadness, and so on and so forth, since they were abstract in nature, and mind had at least three places where it had some kind of an empty space, so to speak, which was discovered by the dissection, after the dissection of human brain, human skull rather. So it was believed that most of these abstract ideas basically are spatially located, somewhere over there. That was the broad idea. So overall idea that I'm trying to put forth here is that one shouldn't believe that we never had any access towards the brain, but the idea is that around, if you want to look at what was going on in sciences around the time when this theory was developing, that is identity theory, we find that imaging techniques were progressing very fast. X-rays had been discovered, and apart from that, in 1960, a Russian scientist had already had made public his idea of magnetic resonance imaging, though it was not called MRI at that time. It had a different connotation, and the machine also sort of initially looked very different, where the person would stand, and this is how the imaging was done. And in the current design, the machine, the person lies down. But apart from those factors, it was around the time when imaging techniques were making fast progress, and so overall there was some kind of renewed confidence that we can have access into the human mind, and we can probably know the structure, so to speak, of different brain states. So overall, here in identity theory, which emerges around 1960, the main idea is that brain, which is material in nature, could and its different states, could explain the psychological counterpart, the mental counterpart of it. So, as we are already aware, one of the core problems in philosophy of mind is that on the one hand, human experience is abstract in nature, and on the other, the seat of these human experiences is human body, which is physical in nature, and there has to be a coordination between the two. This some sort of disconnect needs to be explained. How sort of something that is non-material could have any sort of connection anywhere with the non-material, and this connection is inevitable if given the fact that all human experiences are located in human bodies, so that cannot be denied. So given that fact, as we have already discussed, one way of coming out of this problem is that to believe that even human experiences of physicality of things is basically nothing but ideas. Therefore, sort of there could be some kind of an idealist reduction of things. the kind we find in several philosophies. Berkeley famously talked about subjective idealism, what we call today subjective idealism, and so one way is to explain the physical in terms of ideas, which would amount to some kind of idealist reductionism. The other idea is that you explain human experiences which are non-physical in nature in terms of their material counterpart, and this approach is called materialism. And we have already seen that behaviorism is in a certain way a different a kind of a brand of this approach. Where we want to, we believe that of any for any mental state, there is an empirical counterpart in the world. There are some environmental causes, and all mental states also lead to some kind of physical states. So we believe that certain environmental causes result in certain bodily states, certain manifest behavior. So this way we want to bypass in a certain way, as already discussed, if A were to represent environmental factors, environmental causes, B were to represent the mental states, and C were to stand for the manifest behavior, then the behaviorist approach tries to bypass the B counterpart. So, we don't want to talk about B, and we want to believe that A, that is environmental causes, result in certain bodily manifest behavior, and therefore we can try and correlate the two and theorize about them and construct theories about it. So, but now the as far as identity theory is concerned, identity theory does not want to bypass the brain states, that is like E, which is represented by B in this equation. So, identity theory rests upon the idea that it is possible to somehow we'll have to explain our psychological states some way or the other in terms of certain brain states, certain material states inside our brain. So that is generally speaking the broad idea about identity theory. And here one of the important commitment that any philosopher who believes in, who sides with identity theory makes is that if certain mental states could be explained in terms of certain brain states, so then there is some kind of indiscernibility between the two that we'll have to maintain. So that would mean that anybody experiencing particular kind of a brain state is inevitably necessarily going through certain kind of mental events, certain kind of mental states. And also, if somebody is experiencing some kind of psychological state, then that person also has the corresponding brain state. So if there is some kind of a brain state for pain, then any person experiencing pain would have that corresponding brain state. So this is broadly speaking the kind of commitment you are making if you are an identity theorist. And also, another thing that we want to sort of take into consideration here is that that there could be two ways of talking about events in the events in the brain, or there could be sort of two ways of talking about brain states. One is that we believe that to any mental counterpart, there is some physical counterpart in the brain. So that would be like to any instance of pain, there would be a corresponding physical state to it. And another way of putting it could be that any mental event has a corresponding, so to speak, some kind of event in the brain. So that basically is like here what we are suggesting, what we are leading towards is something very important in identity theory, something called token type distinction, about which we'll talk as we proceed, and as you will talk about it when we start talking about different objections that are placed before the identity theorists. So first of all, the broad idea that we need to understand behind identity theory is that there is no need to basically, they wouldn't be talking about so much, they don't want to concern, identity theorists don't want to concern themselves about the environmental causes like behaviorist does. And they want to just they want to just look at the two variables of the equation. One is what goes on inside our brain, and the experience of it. As a matter of fact, they are not even so much concerned about the manifestation of it. So, whereas in behaviorist approach, the approach was entirely the observation of the behavior of the organism, of a particular organism, vis-a-vis the stimulus that it was given. So it was, so to speak, the approach constituted in observation of external stimulus and response. Now, as opposed to that, identity theory approach relies completely, on the idea that there are certain mental events undeniably there, and those need to be explained in terms of certain brain states, both of which are supposed to be inside the person who's experiencing them. So this approach rests upon the idea that is internalist in a certain way, in the sense that we don't want to rely upon the external factors, in terms of stimulus and response. We want to completely try and understand, mental states in terms of the brain states. Something that because of the problem that mental states, since they are not observable, this entire issue was in a certain way bypassed by the behaviorists. And another thing that we need to take into account is that as far as behaviorism in philosophy is concerned, so what we call philosophical behaviorism or logical behaviorism, basically was an idea that came out of certain demands that were put forward by logical positivists. So it is more of the nature of semantic requirement. as we have already talked about it, philosophy had witnessed, especially the Anglo-Saxon tradition had witnessed something that we call linguistic turn, where analysis of language and what is meaningful, what is meaning constituted in, how to sort of define meaning of a thing, or what should be the criteria of defining the meaning of the thing. These were the questions that became central to the discipline of philosophy. And there, the sort of behaviorism, the behaviorist approach arises of the idea of what, basically the question that they want to put before themselves is what are the material conditions of using certain words which supposedly refer to some mental events like pain, pleasure, and so on and so forth. So there the approach had something at least in philosophy. We are not talking about psychological behaviorism here. So at least in philosophical behaviorism, the question was more pertaining to language. The question was more semantic in nature. We want to have a kind of a semantic explanation for how to use certain words which are generally associated with the mind and the events therein. So here, in contrast to that, as far as identity theory is concerned, the idea is that here the approach has to be very different. Here we are not talking about language. Here we do not want to sort of define the material conditions for the meaning, say for example, of the word pain. Here the idea is what is pain constituted in. How to materially, so to speak, how to materially define pain. What is it constituted of? What is the material, so to speak, composition, if you will, of certain mental states? So here the approach has to be very different. Here the approach has to be, so to speak, empirical in nature. Given a certain kind of experience, the scientist, has to discover what has to be its counterpart in the brain. And this has been also an approach which neurologists are still continuing with. So one of the main methodologies that neurologists have been using is they have been studying patients who become who become impaired, neurologically impaired in a certain way. So, say for example, there's a patient who knows what a thing is, but is unable to come up with a name for it. As a matter of fact, there is actually a patient like that. And now, if you come across patients like this, then you know that there is some kind of cognitive impairment that the patient has gone through, and then you would want to look at the brain anatomy. You would want to have an image of the brain of that person, and you would want to see which part has undergone some damage. And whichever part has undergone some damage, you can conclude from that observation is responsible for the kind of impairment, cognitive impairment that you observe in that particular person. So, there has to be certain kind of correlation that needs to be established with a particular kind of cognitive issue, certain kind of mental state a person is in, and the missing counterpart. So this is how. So the point here is that this is an important scientific approach. There is something that is distinctive about this approach is that that it gives you direction towards research. So it gives you certain directions towards neurological research. It can give you certain research programs in science. So this is to sort of come back again to the same problem. So the main approach here is to establish some kind of correlationship between certain kind of mental experiences and certain kind of brain states. So now, having understood the methodological approach in identity theory, let's look at some of the issues that arise in this approach, and because this approach it's fairly sort of not so difficult to understand what exactly are the presumptions presumptions that an idealist theorist wants to work with. As a matter of fact, this approach is more famous for the kind of debate it generated among different philosophers and the kind of arguments, counter arguments that were offered regarding this approach. Now, one of the main objections about regarding this approach comes from a philosopher named Jerome Schaeffer. Jerome Schaeffer points out a philosophical issue when we take this approach. He points out that when we are talking about brain processes, we can with fair amount of justification, we can say that all brain states would have a certain location. So brain states are locational. So if there are certain mental events that a person is going through, and at the same time we look at the MRI scans of a particular person, then we know that these brain states are occurring in a particular location, not only inside the brain also. It has a particular location. It could be anterior lobe, or it could be somewhere else, or brain has now we know that brain has so many different parts, and different parts are responsible for different kind of cognitions that we have. So all these brain states are locational. They have certain kind of properties. Say, for example, only physical things have certain kind of properties, like having a location. They occupy like in some kind of space somewhere. So similarly, all the brain states would have some kind of a location. It is a part of their nature to be locational in a certain way. Whereas psychological states don't seem to be spatial in nature. They don't seem to occupy any space. So, say for example, if somebody were to ask you, put the pain that you're experiencing, place it here. We want to have a look at it. It lacks that kind of it doesn't occupy space it doesn't have the same kind of spatial features that brain states have. But as pointed out earlier, if brain states and psychological states are identical, then properties that we ascribe to one, we must be able to ascribe the same set of properties to the other as well. So this is the broad idea that Schaeffer is pointing out. We'll continue our discussion around this. We'll return after a short break. Thank you. Welcome back, viewers. So, as we were talking about it, identity theory is, fairly sort of is an idea which is otherwise not so difficult to understand, but it is more famous for the kind of discussion, the number of arguments that have been that have been generated against it, and the counter arguments that have emerged from other philosophers. So in that line, we were discussing, the first objection, that comes that is put forward by a philosopher named Jerome Schaffer, who says that when we if we believe that some brain states are equivalents of certain mental states, if there is some kind of equivalence between the two, there's some kind of identity between the two, then what is true about one side has to be true about the other side as well. But if we talk about brain state, it has certain features which are not true of, which as a matter of fact cannot be, philosophically speaking, logically ascribed to the mental counterpart of it. So the experience of brain is completely something that is abstract, that does not occupy space, but brain states are locational in nature, and we can ascribe location to them. They exist in a particular kind of location, and this is how it's been now possible to sort of treat also certain kind of brain experiences. But the experience of pain, the experiential counterpart of it, the experiential variable of this equation, does not share those properties. So the pain does not it does not occupy any space, so to speak. This is a complete kind of abstract entity. If somebody asks you to show the pain, to put it before that person, it's simply so to speak impossible. So pain, the idea of pain being abstract, similarly actually it can be better understood by some other kind of brain state. Say for example happiness. Now happiness, one could point out, has a certain kind of a brain counterpart. some kind of a physical counterpart in terms of a particular location and so on and so forth. But if somebody asks like about the locational aspect of it, there is no locational aspect, because happiness is not something physical in nature, like pain is something not physical in nature. So that way certain properties that the physical counterpart in this equation seems to have, we find lacking in the mental counterpart. But if we maintain, already that there is some kind of an identity between the two, then the properties ascribed to one should also belong to the properties ascribed to the other. But that doesn't seem to be the case here, and therefore this problem that Jerome Schaffer points out. So, but there is another philosopher who's like almost considered a propounder of this theory, namely U.T. Place. He seems to have some kind of an answer to this problem posed by Jerome Schaffer. U.T. Place points out that when we are talking about human experiences and the corresponding brain state, then it's not necessary. These are two realms, the realm of the brain, physical brain, and the realm of the mental events. These are two different kinds of realms. So the properties of one, may not have may not belong to the other realm, to the other side of the equation. And when we put that demand, he says that demand arises because of what U.T. Place calls phenomenological fallacy. So what he points out is that there are, say for example, the experience of red. So suppose we see, we are looking at an object which appears to be red. We have the experience of we see it to be red, but when we look at the brain state doesn't seem to have any kind of, so to speak, redness about it. So like there are three sort of counterparts there: the experience, the brain counterpart of it, the physical brain counterpart of it, and the person who's observing that physical counterpart of a certain experience. Now, the person who's looking at the brain state of the person who's having a certain kind of experience sees that even though the person under observation reports the seeing of red, there is nothing of the kind of redness to be seen inside the brain of that person. So this is broadly speaking what the problem is. So U.T. Place says that human experiences have certain kind of properties. Say for example so the experience of redness and so on and so forth, and brain states are of a different kind. So brain states would not have the very same properties, because brain states are physical in nature. They can account for that experience, but it doesn't mean that same properties should be ascribed to the mental events as well. So it's a different thing for to account for certain experiences in material terms. But if you reduce it, if you understand it as as a demand to sort of to look for the same kind of properties in the physical explanation of it, then it's according to U.T. Place. It's a kind of a demand that rests upon the presumption that the properties that could be ascribed to experience, the same properties have to be there in the physical counterpart of it as well. So there is, so we are committing fallacy here. We are assuming that properties of experience, should be ascribable to the physical corresponding state of it, since we are presuming some kind of indiscernibility between the two, some kind of identity between the two, some kind of non-difference between the two. But according to UT Place, this constitutes a phenomenological fallacy because we phenomenologically speaking, experience has a very different nature, and the physicality, the physical counterpart, cannot have the same kind of properties, and it's the wrong kind of demand. So UT Place seems to have some kind of reply to this kind of demand, that is this kind of objection that is raised about identity theory. Another objection that is often put against identity theory is that when we are having certain experiences, since those experiences arise out of certain brain states, therefore the knowledge that this experience is arising out of a particular brain state should be a part of that experience. So suppose I know something, to be read, I'm seeing something to be read, then the knowledge of something being read should also somewhere include the knowledge that this entire mental episode, this entire cognitive episode is arising out of a certain brain state. So any knowledge which is, so to speak, in a certain way tantamount to some kind of a mental event. So any knowing episode is a mental event. And since it is arising out of a physical, event in the brain, therefore the knowledge of, the knowledge constituted by that brain state should also include the knowledge that it's arising of a particular brain state. But it stands to, common sense observation that whenever we are talking about any kind of knowledge, it does not, either logically or empirically or in whatever way, also has as an inevitable part of it the knowledge that this this knowing, this knowledge episode is arising as a result of some physical event in the brain. So that being the case, there may not be any direct connection between the kind of identity that we assume between between a particular mental event and its physical counterpart. That doesn't seem to be very plausible, given this fact about the human experience, that when we experience something concomitantly, we don't experience it to be occurring somewhere inside the brain. But one of the sort of answers that we can anticipate here is that when we are talking about a particular thing, it's not necessary that we know everything about that particular thing. Say, for example, if I know that such and such person is the President of India, does not mean that I know everything about that person. It doesn't. The knowledge of somebody being the President of India doesn't mean that I know the entire history. I know the entire biography of that person. I know the current scenario, current habits of that person, and so on and so forth, or the knowledge of all the experiences that person is going through, all the mental events, and so on and so forth. So knowledge, having knowledge of something does not, amount to the commitment that when I know something, I know everything about that particular thing that I'm claiming to know. But in a certain way, if we look at this reply a little closely, we'll find that the kind of problem that is addressed by this objection is not properly is not properly addressed in the reply to it, because here the issue is, when you are talking about knowledge as a mental event. Here we are talking about knowledge as a mental event, knowledge which is something abstract, unlike say for example President of India, who's who's a sort of properly physically defined human being. So here we are talking about, as opposed to that, we are talking about mental event, and when we have when we have some kind of mental event, then it should also include, to be sort of comprehensive in nature, it should include the knowledge of the brain state that is it's arising of. As a matter of fact, this kind of objection, points towards certain more complex, certain other kind of objections, like that there's some kind of complexity involved in whenever we're talking about human experiences. So say for example, when we are talking about pain experience, the experience of pain, and so on and so forth, it's not that we could simply point out that pain in philosophy of mind is defined as firing of C fibers. So you cannot say, well, any instance of firing of C fibers is basically pain. That would mean that suppose we had some kind of live tissues of C fiber, and we stimulate them. We say, well, hey, see, this is the pain occurring. This is an instance of occurrence of pain. It'll sound nonsensical. So every experience has certain kind of complexity, has certain kind of unity. Even when we are experiencing pain, there could be so many other things going on at the same time concomitantly, and so on and so forth. So that complexity, is difficult, or the unity of certain kind of experiences that we go through. That unity of experience is difficult to account for the kind of picture that identity theorist presents before us, like reducing certain experiences to certain mental to certain occurrences in the brain. So this is one. Then also the problem regarding a perception. We have perception, but whenever I not only know, but at the same time I also know that I know. I have certain experiences, and I make that into judgments, according to the contexts. I form different kind of judgments, and I try to unify the different kind of experiences that I could be going through. The very idea of, say for example, I arises because all those mental events are happening at are happening to a particular person, is happening to a particular self. So given that, it's difficult to account for the fact that all human experiences belong, that there is that there is a counterpart of a perception of to any perception, to so to speak. So simply defining a mental episode in terms of a certain brain state has to account for all these different counterparts to to human experience. Also, let's not ignore the fact that there could be different kind of adjectives also that you could attach to certain kind of occurrence of pain. Say, for example. So you could not only say, for example, like, I mean, if you are experiencing some kind of pain, doctor is very likely to ask you, the physician is very likely to ask you, well, what kind of pain is it? Is it very sharp? Is it some kind of a shooting pain? Is it does it have a very well defined location somewhere? Is it spasmodic in some way? Are you experiencing some kind of spasms of pain? What is the intensity of it, and so on and so forth. So there could be different kind of adjectives that we attach to pain. The pain experiences could be qualitatively different. There are also people, ironically. There are people who inflict pain upon themselves. We call this tendency sadistic. So they drive some kind of pleasure out of pain experience. So overall idea here is that there could be different episodes of pain could be qualitatively different. And when we talk about pain, say for example, the way identity theorist often does, by sort of defining it in terms of some kind of firings of certain nerves, and so on and so forth, that qualitative aspect of it somewhere is not taken into account. It's difficult to talk about the experience could be qualitatively different. So that way, the defining human experiences in terms of certain physical states inside a brain involves glossing over the degree of complexity that a given experience has. Also, the problem of the apperception, the unification of experience. And also the experiences, certain experiences being qualitatively different. So that being the case, identity theorist has some serious issues. Some serious issues at hand, but now having looked at the idea of identity theory in a very broad way, now let's proceed to some of the core, some of the very sort of important main objections that have been placed against identity theory. One of these objections comes from one of the best known philosophers of mind, David Chalmers. David Chalmers tries to refute identity theory by asking us to entertain a thought experiment, and thought experiment has been something that has been favorite with many famous philosophers, including Descartes and several others. So like Descartes, wants to entertain this thought experiment that it might be the case that there could be a devil inside our mind, and he's putting certain ideas inside our mind. Whenever I sort of try to calculate, whenever I try to put two and two together, this devil puts this idea inside me that 2 + 2 is equal to 5. So these are, this is something that you call that you call the technique of thought experiments. Suppose this. So similarly, David Chalmers wants us, to take a thought experiment and believe that there could be, suppose there were some philosophical zombies, or what is also called neurological zombies. Now, what is the idea of neurological zombies? Neurological zombies are supposed to be certain beings who are physiologically speaking absolutely identical to us. So these zombies would have all the chemicals, all the different different physiological components that our body has. So it has all the so-called rods and cones in their eyes. It has all the nerve fibers. It has everything, physiologically speaking, that a human being has. But they do not have the corresponding mental events. So these zombies are of such nature that they may have certain, when you look inside their mind, they may have a particular brain state that we associate with some kind of an experience. So, say for example, this zombie could have a brain state corresponding to pain, and could as well be showing the pain behavior, as it could be even telling you that this he or she is in pain. So the zombie could actually have physiological appearance of pain, and could also manifest, and could also report the experience of it. Could also manifest the behavior associated with those experiences. But at the same time, it actually does not have those experiences. Now the point here, because the point that we need to take into account, because otherwise it'll this idea would look absolutely bizarre to us. The idea here is that logically, David Chalmers points out, logically we can imagine for something like this to exist. There is no logical fallacy committed here. It's not contradictory for us to imagine. Something like this. And since it's possible to imagine an entity like this without undergoing at the same time, without committing at the same time any logical fallacy, any logical contradiction. Therefore, their logical possibility suggests that the idea of brain state as a counterpart, as a physical counterpart of mental events, does not follow from each other. So if it's possible for us to imagine brain states which do not have a mental counterpart, then this imagination, which is without any logical fallacy, is sufficient for us to show that there could be brain events without any corresponding mental events. And if that is possible, even in imagination, without involving ourselves into any contradiction, that means there is no, to maintain that brain states and mental states are identical to each other, it would be wrong for us to suppose that. So the overall idea in the argument put forward by David Chalmers is that there is no, so to speak, logical connection between brain states and mental states. We could talk about mental states in separation from mental states, and no logical contradiction is so to speak so to speak, involved here. And since no logical contradiction is involved, that means somewhere we'll have to keep the two sides of the equation separate. We cannot so to speak, conflate the two. And now there is an interesting reply to that by several philosophers, but Daniel Dennett is famous for his reply. But I don't think we have time for that today. So viewers, we'll talk about more objections, also including Mary's room argument. We'll talk about these objections in our next lecture, and we probably talk about functionalism. So that's all for today. Thank you.
With this note, thank you, sir. Thank you so very much for giving us a productive session. And dear friends, do write to us at info.cc@nic.in. We would be meeting again soon. Till then, take care. Goodbye. Thank you, sir. Thank you once again.